Whoa, is it just me, or is this a tasty treat? No, it's not just me. This is, in fact, a delicious, nutritious little doorstop. What you'll see here is we've got a very nice slope there with a nice even top there, or plateau there. We've also come through here, and as we're coming through, we've got this beautiful soft curve coming around, but it's not ready to be finished yet. And we need to do the sanding process before we move on to this finishing process. The finishing process includes going ahead and adding any oils or estepols to it. Now, to do this, we need to come through and remove all pencil marks. Now, of course, I've got pen on mine because I was dealing with the dark timber so you could see it. But you should have 0 pen on yours. We also want to go through and remove any marks that may have occurred during the planing process. To simulate this, I've gone through and I've used my linisher and run it sideways along my piece of timber. And you should be able to see that there's indentations and scratches going along my piece of timber here. It's pretty ugly. Now, we do want to remove those. Now, one hint I will give you is when you're sanding, always go with the grain, because it's going to indent the timber or scratch the timber less and be better hidden. And that's always what we're after. But before we can start sanding, I guess the question is, where do we even start? Well, when we're sanding, we've got in front of me, I've got 4 different grits of sandpaper. These are pretty standard sandpapers when in the furniture industry. You'll generally start off sanding, depending on what your grit is, with either a 80 or a 120 grit sandpaper. These are often known as, it goes from medium to fine to super fine to ultra fine. And we never really, in woodworking, it's rare that we get past fine. I think fine for the majority of woodworking jobs is appropriate, which is these 180 and 240 grits we've got right here. Now, when we're looking at these 2 sheets of sandpaper, they look relatively similar, to be honest. Pretty close to it. You can feel a difference here. And if I was to pick up this 240, all of a sudden you do start to see a bit of a difference. And what this represents is, if we look at it really closely, you should be able to see that this 80 grit paper in the front here, it's actually coarser or rougher than the 120, and then especially to that 240. Now, the way they got 80 grit, or the way 80 grit came about, is because when sandpaper, which is now normally referred to as garnet paper, but when sandpaper or abrasive paper came around, they used sand itself. And the 80 grit came to 80 pieces of sand per 1 inch on that paper, or 1 square inch. So presuming that's 1 inch by 1 inch across there, they could fit approximately 80 pieces of sand in that nice area there, which means that the sand granules were quite large. As you got higher and higher, you needed smaller sand granules to fit more and more pieces of sand per inch, or per square inch. Now, that is why we have the different types of sandpaper, or different coarsenesses of sandpaper. When we're going through, you normally always want to start at the most coarse, so the lowest number, and work your way up through the ranks, up to the highest number you have access to. For this, when we sand, I always like to start with 80 grit, as I said. I'm just going to use this sanding block here because it's a quick, easy grab one. Now, if you haven't got this beautiful made one that we're going to be making in class, these ones from Bunnings or your local hardware store are approximately $2 to $3, and they do a great job if you're just doing sanding for a short amount of time. From here, you're going to want to come through and you're going to want to sand along the grit of your paper, like so. After you've done that and you've got all your marks there, go ahead and either erase the pencil or sand it off. Erasing is generally a quicker method.
Make sure that you go over every single edge. You can use a clamp to hold it, you can use a vise to hold it, but you must make sure that you work through the grits. Now, the idea with sanding is that you work through the grits. When you first start with 80 grit, it's going to leave large scratches, which then you go to 120 grit, which leaves smaller scratches again and removes the large ones. From there, you'll move to 180, which once again will remove the 120 grit scratches and leave scratches from 180, which is why then you finish off with 220 grit. The scratches are so small that the human eye can't really see them, and so that is the sanding process. Be very thorough, do every edge, and ensure to make sure you've removed all pencil lines.
Look at that. It is looking schmicko. But the sanding process hasn't finished yet. Like I said, a lot of the time the finer details, actually go through and make a project. And for this, we want to come through and we want to give these, the edges here, you got two options here. You could break the edge. Now, when you break the edge, it simply means getting a piece of, say, 180 grit sandpaper and just going over the edge to remove any of the sharpness. It could also be done with 240 grit sandpaper. And you break that edge there. And it makes something look a little bit more finished and just a bit more aesthetically pleasing. It also increases the tactile response. So you can come across and just do this. Now, another option you could go is to really give those corners a really good curve. And that's what I'm going to do today, because I think that really does increase the aesthetic of it overall. And look at that now, that's starting to become quite a nice little curve there. So once again, I started with 120, I'm then going to move to 180. And then finally go up to 240. Now for this, make sure to go through and do it on all the edges going around, except any bottom edge. Because we're going to stick a piece of leather to that, we're going to leave that one just nice and solid and flat. So I wouldn't even bother breaking the edges on the bottom piece. Alrighty, let's get to it.
Make sure to always work through those grits, checking for any leftover scratch marks from previous grits. Now, thanks for tuning into the Woodwork Experience. The next episode of this tutorial series is going to be on finishing and applying those hard wax oils. Let's get into it.